I'm excited. This should be a really great conversation. So, I'm Matt Hadfield. I'm a medical oncologist at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and I focus on cutaneous oncology and early drug development. So, super excited to talk to Harpreet Singh, who I'll let give your background at the FDA, and then so much to talk about today in terms of lots and lots of changes. So, if you would please introduce yourself.
Yes, sure. Thank you. First, thank you for having me. I'm Harpreet Singh. I'm an oncologist and Chief Medical Officer at Precision for Medicine. We are a global biomarker-based CRO working with small to mid-sized biotech, and we work in the oncology and rare disease spaces. I left FDA a little over a year ago. Was formerly a division director of one of the solid tumor divisions.
And your experience at the FDA and now at Precision Medicine will be so insightful for this conversation. So, obviously, I think it goes without saying, but there's been many changes in terms of the regulatory landscape in the United States over the last several months. Um, in that is the new draft FDA guidance on changes in terms of endpoints. So, we had been using lots of surrogate endpoints previously. Now there's going to be more of a focus on overall survival. So, could you walk us through maybe just in case someone's watching this who doesn't really understand how these trials are designed? I mean, what would be, how you would describe the difference between surrogate endpoints and overall survival? And then, from there, how do these draft guidance change the way we're thinking about trials now?
What I want to say is that I don't think the guidance changes much. I think that it really just puts more instruction and more clarity around how to prioritize overall survival and how to interpret the analysis. But you asked about trial design and surrogate endpoints and kind of how that relates to overall survival. So generally in oncology, there are three, I would say, commonly or widely used endpoints. The first one is overall response rate, and that is very straightforward, and that's just how much is the tumor shrinking. So you're going to have a response rate, and that's, again, tumor reduction and durability of response. Typically, FDA would evaluate this endpoint as a measure of benefit and would evaluate this in a single arm setting. And when is it appropriate to do a trial in a single arm setting? It's when either you have a rare disease or you're able and you can't run a randomized trial, or you are going after this accelerated approval pathway, which is something that it's not unique to the FDA. EMA does have some version of this, but it's definitely widely utilized by sponsors seeking FDA approval. So in an accelerated approval, in the federal regulations for accelerated approval, you can approve a drug based on an intermediate, or the term, yes, surrogate endpoint is used. And what that means is that's an earlier endpoint, and so it takes less time to get to a response rate because you're administering the therapy and then you're watching the cytoreduction. So you're seeing the tumor shrink, and then you're following those patients out for duration of response. And so this classically has been seen as one of the more quicker paths to an approval. The criteria are that you have to have results that are better than what's available for patients. So as you can imagine, there's many accelerated approvals, but there was a recent accelerated approval for zongertinib. That's the most recent one I can think of, for HER2 mutated lung cancer, for which there's only one FDA approved therapy, and that's an ADC that's given IV and HER2, and it has a response rate of about 50 to 60%. And that was approved on a single arm study. This is a rare tumor, but it's big enough to randomize. So, but zongertinib was approved recently with about a 70% response rate in frontline patients, and as a monotherapy oral agent for this rare mutation. So really only one therapy technically available already, and this is showing that it has the potential to be better than that available therapy. FDA stopped using the term surrogate and switched to the term intermediate.
Mm.
And the reason for that is because a surrogate endpoint actually has to meet certain statistical criteria, which are called the Prentice criteria. And as it turns out, more basically put, response rate does not always translate into long-term benefit. So practically speaking, you could have a drug that generates a response rate and then take that same asset and put it in a randomized design. And there's not a guarantee that even though the response rate was better than the historically available response rate, in this case, docetaxel, let's say, when you put this into a randomized trial against docetaxel, you're not always seeing a win, if you will, on the long-term endpoint, progression-free survival, overall survival. So it's not technically a surrogate endpoint. We call it an intermediate endpoint because it's just earlier. So the benefit to patients, obviously, is that they get to have access to these therapies earlier in the course of their development. And then it's up to the sponsor to then confirm benefit. And typically that's through a randomized trial in which progression-free survival or overall survival are the endpoint. So I'm going to pause there for any feedback or questions on that.
No, yeah, no, thank you. That's such a good overview and really important points about the accelerated approval pathway and how these intermediate endpoints can lead to approvals. With the context of that, what do you think the big changes are now in terms of the FDA's recent guidance on this, and what can we expect in terms of how this will change and to what degree it will change things in terms of how trials are conducted?
So the recent draft guidance talks about approaches to assessment of overall survival in oncology trials. So this is about design considerations for oncology trials when overall survival is not the primary endpoint. And I just spent time telling you how overall survival is the golden endpoint and that what patients want is to live. And they want to know that they will live longer if they take this drug. However, frequently in oncology studies, as you know, and I'm sure you can give me some examples from your own, practice, often overall survival is not a practical endpoint. And I mean, multiple myeloma is one disease where it tends to be impractical. I
I would
see,
say honest, yeah. I mean, thankfully, like prostate cancer too. I mean, you really can't do overall survival. It would take you know decades to conduct a study like that. So yeah, and melanoma is another one where we made so much progress. So yeah,
yeah.
what are they focusing on in terms of guidance now when this isn't feasible?
It's not feasible. So first of all, to be clear, FDA, so why is it not feasible sometimes to have an overall survival endpoint? So we talked about these diseases, but what is it? There's many therapies available. And so from a design perspective, if someone's on a clinical trial and they do progress, they're going to go on to get, there have been over 20 therapies approved for multiple myeloma in the last 10 years. So people are going 5, 6, 7 lines of therapy. So even if they progress on, let's say it's a second line myeloma trial, they're going to go get subsequent therapies. And those therapies and that extended benefit confounds the trial's ability to demonstrate an overall survival advantage, just statistically speaking and design speaking. So that's one reason that you can't use survival. Another reason is, of course, what you talked about is feasibility, is time. If patients are with prostate cancer, as you raised, are living 5, 10 years past their initial diagnosis, even having metastatic disease, is it appropriate for patients to have to wait that long for novel therapies to be developed and to be approved, given that they need to meet this survival endpoint? So there's several reasons why FDA is saying, we understand that this may not always be practical, but still we need to look at it. And what FDA has espoused is part of this guidance and predating this guidance is that overall survival is actually a safety outcome. We need to know if the benefit that's being conferred in a short term, in an intermediate endpoint like response rate or like progression-free survival will translate into long-term benefit, or is there something that's giving near-term or short-term benefit that ultimately, doesn't confer survival or could be actually detrimental to survival outcomes, which is what we have seen in the PI3 class of drugs in hematologic malignancies. So in order to make sure that we are putting drugs on the market, that FDA is putting drugs on the market where the benefits do in fact outweigh the risk, they've put forth these recommendations for how one should evaluate overall survival, even when it is not the primary endpoint. And so there's really three components to this. The first is pre-specified planning. When you're designing a study, when companies are designing studies, they should include overall survival as part of the safety analysis. And that means including monitoring and data gathering protocols for overall survival. So what that means is, what we've classically seen is that if the primary endpoint is progression-free survival, once a patient meets that endpoint, meaning they progress and they move on to the next therapy, there has not been a harmonized, robust way or plan or basically instructions to follow those patients out for survival. Obviously, this adds some operational, lift to sponsors and stakeholders designing studies. This means they need to follow patients longer, even
A lot of
after
extra cost to them,
until death. Yeah, cost, monitoring, right? You have to keep track of these patients. And really importantly is also to understand subsequent therapies. What are they getting next? And in the past, for various reasons, which was basically a lack of awareness and appreciation of how important this data is, it has not been routinely collected. So this guidance is saying FDA is going to look at this overall survival data, and therefore we should really make a concerted effort, a priori, to plan to collect it. We want to design the study to rule out harm. So that's the first thing. Number two is taking into account things like subgroups and unique trial designs. So you want to identify biologically plausible subgroups a priori. So what does that mean? So that means, and Precision lives in this space, right? When you're running a trial that is biomarker driven, that BRCA is a good example, right? So we saw the PARP inhibitors. You saw this in prostate cancer, in ovarian cancer. PARP inhibitors, biologic plausibility is that it likely works best for patients who have BRCA mutations or MRD or, these disruptions, distinctions in their genetic profile. However, most of the studies that studied these class of agents enrolled all comers, so patients regardless of whether they had this biomarker or not. And ultimately, what we did see and what FDA did take some decisive actions on are, even though the trial enrolled all these patients, they want to see the long-term benefit by biologically plausible subgroups. And if in fact, and what they found in these examples is, in fact, the patients who lacked these mutations, lacked the biomarker, their benefit, the benefit that they derived was much less than the benefit derived from those who harbor the biomarker or the mutations. And therefore, is the risk that they will incur, is it appropriate? Is this benefit risk assessment enough to garner an approval for the biomarker negative? And in several cases with FDA, the FDA has determined, in part by looking at the survival data for these biologically plausible subgroups, that in fact, no, patients are not living longer who lack the biomarker. And so that has led to some, restricted indications. So that's part of it too. So it's the a priori planning to do pre-specified planning. It's the subgroups and then the unique trial design. So this part, is interesting because I think this is a case by case discussion, but things like crossover and unequal randomization can blur survival results. And in this guidance, FDA says they should be limited where possible. I think we should talk about that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, a trial that does not offer crossover. When is that appropriate? And when do you think it may not be appropriate? And that crossover really should be a part of this study to give patients access to the experimental therapy.
Right. No, I mean that's a excellent topic to transition to. But even before we do, I think it is important to know that this because I think there's a lot of controversy around the changes that are happening in the regulatory landscape right now, and it's not as if they're completely unfounded. I mean, there has been drugs that had accelerated approvals that were then had negative studies that ended up leading to a revoking of that approval. Like you mentioned the PI3 kinase inhibitor story and hematological malignancies. So, I mean, if you think about that, you're exposing patients to risk when there's not actually a benefit. So there's a lot of things here. And when you think about like biomarker driven cancers, um, you know, when you have all comers, then a subgroup has the biomarker that you actually think is going to work, and then you meet an endpoint, but the subgroup is just pulling the entire trial up. And we saw that with PD-L1 positive and gastric cancer and to your point, ovarian cancer with PARP inhibitors. So there's a lot of important points that are being pointed out here that they are addressing that I think we shouldn't just characterize that everything's changing for the bad, and you know what I mean, because there's a lot of critiques and criticisms flying around. But getting back to your question, so I would love to hear your opinion actually. So with crossovers, with crossover, because you have all the FDA experience. So with crossover trials, the argument here is that if you have something that's efficacious, you don't withhold it from the control group. You allow them to cross over, and this is challenging because, in my opinion, it would make trials of novel targeted therapeutics more accessible because, in my mind, if you have a targeted therapy and you enroll to an inferior arm and you offer the crossover if they progress, that's much more appealing than staying in the arm that you think is inferior, like an outdated therapy, especially as you think about like targeted therapies like KRAS inhibitors. What happened in that landscape. But well, I mean, what do you think regarding crossover?
Look, I think something you said that's interesting is the inferior arm, right? So when you walk into a clinical trial, it should be to answer a question. And if as an investigator, you already feel that the control arm is inferior, one must ask, why are we doing this study and is there buy-in? And what we know, and you brought up the KRAS space, and you may know that I presided over the approval of the first two KRAS drugs approved by the FDA, both sotorasib for KRAS mutated lung cancer and then adagrasib about a little less than a year later.
I don't know, just because like that's such a fascinating story. If anyone's interested, were you part of the AACR stories on that? Like, did you do an interview for that? Because
I
that,
did
that
the ad hoc. I mean,
yeah, yeah, there's like such a interesting story, and how that led into Project Optimus. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
yes, yes. And it was kind of happening similarly, but yes, I've written about this. I wrote, I have an article with Rick Pasner in JCO, in Journal of Clinical Oncology, about the dosing conundrum. It's called the retrofit, lessons learned from sotorasib's dosing conundrum, because we were in a conundrum. But about crossover, that study, Codebreak 200, randomized patients to sotorasib versus docetaxel, and at the outset did not institute crossover. And what we saw was a lot of asymmetric dropout, meaning, and again, it was an open label trial. So that means patients knew what they were being randomized to. Yes, the gold standard is a double-blinded placebo-controlled trial. That was not possible because this was an oral targeted therapy and the standard of care available was IV docetaxel every 3 weeks. It is not appropriate to give patients IV placebo. That introduces risk, that's unnecessary and undue patient burden. So these trials, and there are many of these examples, have to be open label. So you can imagine that as the study was designed, there was no crossover. And so once patients knew that they were randomized to docetaxel, they viewed the control arm as inferior, and perhaps so did the investigators. And so many of them dropped out of the trial, leading to imbalances in the study arms. And ultimately, this pattern of behavior, and there are some other examples as well, within the study conduct led to FDA, and at that time, me and my division and my statisticians, not being able to reliably interpret the study. We did through, we did institute process through negotiations with Amgen at the time of the accelerated approval. We had a novel drug on our hands that had about a 36% response rate. And so I expected that there would be dropout on their randomized study. And so we talked about them instituting crossover, which they did. But by the time they modified the design and got the protocol through and instituted crossover, a lot of the asymmetric dropout had already happened. But in trials like that, you do want to give patients access, as you're pointing out, to the novel therapy. But as we know, statistically, that would potentially confound the overall survival. And FDA is saying, we're going to look at survival. And so this is a point for me that really needs to be walked through with the agency trial by trial. We cannot design trials that don't offer crossover just to preserve the impact on survival. We have to model out what the impact of crossover would look like, and then a priori plan for that with the expectation that our survival outcomes will be confounded by crossover, and we understand.
No, and you actually circled back to a really great point from before, because like with the sotorasib story, which is kind of like the, one of the big, landscape changing, I mean, drugging the undruggable. But what happened there is you have a targeted therapy to what you were touching on before, a therapy that has biological activity in a subgroup of patients that's biomarker driven compared to chemotherapy. So, to think that, one could be, our propensity would be just biologically that it would be inferior, the chemotherapy, because you're giving a targeted therapy. I mean, we obviously don't know that until we conduct the trial, but it makes it very hard if when you have these novel therapies that are emerging compared to older, outdated therapies, you're trying to, navigate that space. Then, as you mentioned, can you have crossover and then interpret it in a way that makes sense? So it's lots and lots of things that are, it's complex to kind of walk that line between keeping patients safe, but also giving them access to, cutting edge therapies as fast as possible.
Yeah, and so the last piece of the guidance talks about analysis. So it's pre-specified planning to look at OS. It's what are the subgroups and what are the trial designs. And then the last piece of the guidance is about analysis. So what are the metrics? What's the follow-up length? What are the strategies that you would use to account for missing data? How do you include like intercurrent events, like all-cause mortality as an example? So if a patient with cancer progresses on a study and then gets into a car accident, should that count? That's an intercurrent event. They didn't die of their disease. There was, there was an accident. So understanding post hoc analysis for more exploratory reasons. So I think that the guidance, it doesn't really change how FDA is approaching overall survival. I think it puts parameters around how to look at this when you're thinking about designing a study, and understanding that FDA is saying, we understand that overall survival, while the golden endpoint, while the most valuable endpoint for all patients and should be for providers and is, it's simply impractical in many scenarios. But that doesn't let companies off the hook. They still have to find a way to engage with the FDA, to partner with the agency, and really importantly, their biostats teams. And we work through a lot of this at Precision with our clients as well. And how are we going to account for this very important safety endpoint to make sure that these intermediate or early benefits that we're seeing translate into long-term benefit, which is what we all want.
Any parting thoughts on this guidance, and what would you say to anyone who is thinking that re-scrutinizing this is going to restrict access to novel therapies, is because that's something that I've heard multiple times, and I think we really, really do need to rethink the whole accelerated approval pathway. I mean, there's been so many drugs that really, didn't have confirmatory trials, or if they had confirmatory trials, they were negative. So, in my mind, we're not necessarily restricting, access to novel therapies all the time. It's obviously because you don't know, but how do you think that fits into this new landscape of thinking about things?
Look, I think that a failed trial is not a failed drug. And Rick Pazder taught us this. So I don't necessarily see, I've granted dozens of accelerated approvals on single arm trials on response rates. You are correct. Not all of those accelerated approvals have translated into long-term benefit once the assets have been put into randomized designs. And each one you take case by case and say, why did this trial fail? The drug is not a failure, it has a response rate. So, what contributed to this? And usually it's patient selection, endpoint selection, or operational challenges. And being now in a CRO who operationalizes trials, that's very critical. So, all of those, but the first two are part of planning. They're part of the design, they're part of the patients you select, and they're part of the endpoints you select. I think that the accelerated approval pathway is alive and well. It's being utilized because there's a condition in that language that you have to be better than what's available. Well, we have a lot more therapies available now because we've benefited from all this great drug development in oncology. So for that reason, it is a higher bar to meet. When there's nothing available, then a very low response rate, like the 20th percentile range, is probably okay. When there's things available already for patients, you need to demonstrate a benefit above what's above what's currently available, and that's in the regs, that's in the regulations. So I don't think anything's being restricted. I think the survival guidance just puts parameters around how to approach the trial design and basically tells sponsors up front, hey, we need to think about this. The one part of this guidance, and we talked about this, that I do think there needs to be a more robust discussion around strategies is the crossover piece. I think that I have heard, and I'm sure you have too, that some companies don't want to offer crossover in their studies because they are quite concerned about confounding survival and then compromising their probability of regulatory and technical success. To me, that's not acceptable for patients, and we have to be able to work through this in a statistical manner that is what's best for patients. And if that means that when they progress on a chemotherapy like a single agent docetaxel, we offer them crossover to this targeted agent, we need to build that into our models. And I think that that deserves to be kind of double clicked on and interrogated as we design trials.
No, absolutely. That's so well said. I think when you think about crossover, to your point, we can't just say we're gonna not give potentially life prolonging therapy to patients just to preserve statistical integrity, but at the same time, how do we do that in a way and design trials better so that we can do that? So, thank you so much for such a great conversation. Hopefully, we can talk again soon. This has been great.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you.
Take care.